to the cloud, and we are recording. So, and minimize the viewer with you and I in it.
No, not pin video. Oh, here we go. I've put that at the top of the screen. Is that better?
Yep. Well, I can't see it. I've minimized mine, which is probably because I'm recording. So I think that'll be fine.
Okay.
And so go ahead and start us off with prayer.
Okay. Let's begin with prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity we have this afternoon to approach a topic that has been perhaps put aside over the years. We have not dealt with it. And we're going to look at it afresh through the eyes of what we know about Babylon and what we know about Scripture. We ask for your guidance with your Spirit, for understanding, for wisdom, and most of all, for a clear perception of who you are. And we thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen. So my title, as you can see from the slides, is Babylon and the New Jerusalem, Two Views of God. Just a minute. I can't get my slides to move, Bill. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry. The arrow doesn't work for you?
None of the arrows work. Nothing's working.
Ooh. Let me pause the recording. Okay.
So this study is the result of many years of reading and studying and researching ancient Mesopotamia and comparing and contrasting what I learn about it with the Bible. And the reason I call it Babylon and the New Jerusalem is because at the end of the Bible, that is the contrast that is made. So I want to start first with some premises of this study. First of all, ancient Mesopotamia is credited with the earliest cities, with Babylon becoming the first metropolis. And as we will find out next time we come together, Babylon was a huge city. Second premise is that Mesopotamia also seems to have been the first civilization to develop writing, legal institutions, kingship, and economics. And these formed that civilization. The third premise is Mesopotamia influenced civilizations to the east and to the west. This has only recently been discovered, and studies are actually quite meager on it, but the ones that have been done have shown, for example, Babylonian influence on the Babylonian Talmud, Babylonian influence on Greece, and Babylonian influence on Persia. The Babylonians viewed the gods, as my fourth premise, like their earthly kings, using similar legal and economic systems and generally behaving pretty much as petty, selfish human beings behave. And that's a given among scholars. I don't think any scholar questions that. It's very, very clear that what happens down here is a mirror of what happens above, so that the gods act just like human beings. The Bible contains, is my fifth one and final one, a strong anti-Babylonian polemic throughout that is especially strong in Genesis and Revelation, the bookends of the biblical canon. What we're going to be looking at today are Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And we will only do a little bit with chapter 11 because chapter 11 actually begins a new focus. And while there's leadings up to that chapter by how we can compare texts with the flood, for example, in the creation story, to show that there's an anti-Babylonian polemic. Nonetheless, it is especially strong in chapters 10 and 11. So we will only briefly look at those chapters, and next time we will pick up there and continue on. So our methodology, one of the methods is canonical critical study. And this is a fairly recent development in my research. I came several years ago to believe that the Old Testament speaks in two voices. In fact, the whole Bible speaks in two voices. And I can find this in the teachings of Jesus. In Matthew 19, when he talks about divorce law, he actually outlines this way of reading the Old Testament. He points out, Moses allowed you to divorce because of the stiffness of your necks and the hardness of your hearts. But in the beginning, it was not so. So there's these two voices, one that speaks to hard-hearted people, and thus has to speak in language they can understand, and it allows for things that God does not prefer. And then there's the voice of in the beginning of God speaking his preferred will, his ideal will. I have switched those around here and talked about the minor voice of God's preferred will and the major voice of God's will adapted or acquiesced to people's wills. The criteria for discerning which voice speaks is very important, and this is something little done in most canonical critical studies. Most canonical critical studies leave it up to the person doing the study and the community of faith to make decisions between texts of scripture that seem to have disparate meanings. I would like something a little more substantial and substantiated, and so I have formed a criteria for discerning which voice speaks in a specific passage. The first criteria for the minor voice is that it is tied to creation. This is the minor voice of divine preference. The second criterion is that it speaks first in a thematic narrative sequence. And I'll use as an example the conquest. I have students who raise that as a question, and sometimes they use it as support for using violence. But I would suggest that God's preferred voice in the conquest is found in the very first time that the conquest is mentioned. The conquest of Canaan is mentioned in Exodus 23, where God outlines that he is going to bring Israel into Canaan, that he is going to drive out the inhabitants before them using the forces of nature, and that he is gradually going to bring them in to inhabit the land. He says nothing in those verses about killing. What happens is that when God tells the Israelites to despoil the Egyptians, they collect a bunch of weapons. And then when they get through the Red Sea and the Egyptians end up dying in the waters, apparently some of the Israelites may have waded in to the shallow end of the Red Sea and picked up weapons there as well. At least we know they had weapons, because when the Amalekites attacked them on their way to Sinai, Moses sits on a rock, holds up his hands the entire time that the battle rages. And it's Moses who instructs them to wage war. He doesn't seem to consult God. God's voice is very silent in that passage. So, because the people want war, because Moses assumes war, they hear that God is going to put them into the promised land and they're going to have to fight their way in. That's what makes them turn around at Kadesh Barnea and say, we will not go in. But when you get to Joshua, and God encounters Joshua through the angel who calls himself the commander of the Lord's army. The commander of the Lord's army says nothing about waging war against Jericho. Says nothing about performing kerem, which is the Hebrew word for total annihilation. It actually means to devote something to God, but it usually nets total annihilation. It is a word that its counterpart is found in Ugaritic, which is a Canaanite language. And there is a text in Ugaritic that tells how Anat instructs her armies to go out and do karamu, which is the verbal form of kerem in Canaanite, do karamu against her enemies. And they go along with the Hebrew narrative to such an extent that we can say this is the major voice now speaking when you do kerem. What happens in Joshua is, despite God saying nothing about doing kerem, when they get ready to go after the wall falls, just before they enter the city, Joshua says, go into the city and slay everyone, slay everything that breathes. And he tells them to do kerem. As a result, they do it. And from then on, they fight their way into Canaan. So if you go back to the preferred voice in Exodus 23, you know that God's preferred will was to displace the Canaanites, not to slaughter them. But because Israel didn't trust God to do that and took it upon themselves to fight, they took a Canaanite term and Canaanite idea and implemented it in their own strength. So that's what I mean by first in the thematic narrative sequence. And you can, even though I don't have this on here, the major voice then would be taking place after Israel did something different than that preferred preference, and that would mean that God had to divinely adapt. And so later, after Israel makes that decision, God seems to acquiesce and accept and even forward what Israel has done. The third criteria for the minor voice of divine preference is that it stands out unique in the ancient Near East. That is, what happens is that when you compare the biblical text with ancient Near Eastern texts, and this goes beyond Babylon to include all ancient Near Eastern texts, if you see that the text is very similar, it talks about similar ideas, portrays God similarly, that means that it is the major voice of divine adaptation. But if it's unique, if it stands out and actually is opposite or counter in any way to the ancient Near Eastern practices, then it is reflective of God's preferred voice. And what happens when you move to the New Testament on a topic is that very often, the minor voice of God's preferred will speaks again very clearly, and most often is the voice of the New Testament. There are some exceptions to that where there's a mixture of voices, but in the most major issues that I have researched, very often it's the minor voice returns in the New Testament. Now, the major voice of a divine adaptation is reflected in a post-creation and after the initial voice of divine preference. And it harmonizes with the ancient Near East. I think I already covered that. But that's how you can distinguish in any passage what is the major voice and what is the minor voice. Now, the reason I call them minor as the preference and major as the divine adaptation is not because God's preference is minor in any way. I call it that minor because it occurs so infrequently in the Old Testament compared to the major voice. The major voice dominates the Old Testament, and for that reason, I call it the major voice. So we're going to apply the method to this study in terms of creation and uniqueness. In later studies, we will probably add first in a thematic narrative sequence. So now we look at creation in Pneuma Elish. I had asked you to read that for this time. I hope you were able to do that because this will make much more sense if you have. The Pneuma Elish is the Babylonian creation, misnamed because actually Babylonian creation is not predominantly intended to be a creation story. It is predominantly intended to extol and give praise to Marduk as the patron god of Babylon and tell how he gained supremacy over the gods. The story in Pneuma Elish goes as follows. The divine Tiamat, salt water, and Apsu, fresh water, commingle together to create offspring, that is, other gods. Some of their offspring get so noisy that Apsu cannot sleep. He decides to destroy his children. When Ea finds out, he casts a spell on his father and kills him. In Apsu's interior, Marduk was born to Ea and his wife, Damkina. Marduk gets noisy, plays violently, and roils Tiamat. The gods who remain loyal to her incite her to slay the gods connected to the slaying of Apsu. Tiamat creates 11 fierce warriors to go at her side and rallies her troops. Afraid, the rest of the gods debate what to do. After several gods fail to conquer Tiamat and her army, Anu sends a number of them. They all turn tail and run. Marduk agrees to go against her on the condition that the gods make him supreme, the one to order the fates instead of them. The fates are the destinies that the gods were set from year to year about other gods and about human beings that designated what would happen to them and what they were to do. The gods do this, giving him supreme command. That is, they make him supreme. Marduk advances against Tiamat and with special weapons slays her. Out of her body, he creates the world. He holds her followers captive in his net and tramples down the 11 warriors along with their aggressiveness. The gods celebrate Marduk's victory over Tiamat and prostrate before him, calling him our king. Now we come to the creation of humankind in the story. Marduk decides to invent something new, a human being called man who would bear the burden of the gods, providing labor for them so that they could rest. Ea decides that one of the gods should be destroyed so that humans can be fashioned. Marduk convenes the divine assembly and asks who started the war. He calls for the instigator, Kingu, to be handed over. Kingu has been Tiamat's consort, to whom she has given the tablets of destiny. That's the tablets of fates. They impose Kingu's punishment on him and shed his blood. Out of Kingu's blood, they create humankind to be a substitute workforce that is slaves of the gods. Then the gods agree to help Marduk create Babylon, a place where they can rest. You notice there's this theme or motif that runs through this work of gods assailed by noisy gods and deciding to kill them so that they can have rest. And the words for rest used in this work can also mean appeasement. And we'll be looking at that not next time, but the time after that, when we talk about atonement and sacrifice in comparison between the Bible and Babylon. But this motif is a central one of Enuma Elish. And it's very interesting that in order to give life to human beings, a God has to die and shed his blood. And it's out of his blood that human beings are created. Now, we're going to look at creation in the Bible. In Genesis 1 and 2, God begins creation against the backdrop of chaos. And how I view that is that there are several terms in the first few verses, particularly verse 2. There's darkness, there's the deep, and there's tohu wabohu, which means empty and waste, but it has overtones from a literary perspective of meaning chaos. It's used of ancient cities that were ravished by enemy forces and left in ruins. Tohu wabohu is used of them. And it would be that they had returned to chaos. So these terms, all these terms, darkness, the deep, and tohu wabohu, all represent ancient Near Eastern perspectives of chaos and evil. So what Genesis 1 and 2 actually teaches is that sin has already entered the universe. There's already a conflict. And God begins his creation of this world against the background of that conflict. But God, unlike Enuma Elish, God does not slay chaos or destroy it, but transforms it. He shines light into the darkness. He causes dry land to appear with plant life. He fills empty space with dynamic creatures. And finally, he creates human beings in his image. And I emphasize the word in for a reason. It's in his image, not as his image. In Babylonian understanding about image making, and the word used for image here is the same word that the Babylonians use frequently for making images. The concept of that word is that the image becomes, once it is made viable, it becomes the double or substitute of the deity, if it's an image of a deity, or of a king, if it's the image of a king. And as a double, it is divine, therefore it has divinity. And It also serves as a substitute or an extension of the king or the deity. But as a double, it cannot act or think or behave any differently than the king or the god that it represents. If we were made as God's image, we would be his doubles, we would have divinity, and we would be forced to act and think just as God acts and thinks. We would have no autonomy or freedom. But instead, we do not have divinity. And more than that, we do not substitute for divine labor force or act as slaves of God, which in the New English is clearly what's happening. And we are not God's doubles. We have freedom to think, to act freely, and to be creative. God gave humans dominion over nature, but equality with one another. They were to exercise their dominion by serving the earth. And some has been made of the strong words used for having dominion. They were supposed to subdue it. That word subdue can actually mean to rape. And some have struggled with whether that means that we're supposed to ravage the earth like we have. But the fact is that all of these words have a spectrum of meaning. And so they do not mean the harsh terms that could be translated for them in this context. But the reason why the terms are as strong as they are is because Genesis 1 is a polemic against worshiping false gods. And so consequently, the sun is not called the sun and the moon is not called the moon. They're called the great light and the lesser light, which are terms that are used in Mesopotamia as well, but they're not the dominant terms that you would use to apply to deity as the name of the deity. Whereas Shamash in Hebrew for sun sounds very much like Shamash in Akkadian for the Babylonian god Shamash, which is the sun god. So they would have dominion over nature. They were not just to worship nature and become its slaves, because worship in Mesopotamia meant to become slaves of the deity. The end of the creation week, in contrast to the theme of rest and appeasement in the New English, God institutes Sabbath as a day of cessation from work. And the word there really does mean to cease rather than to rest. Now, in the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20, the word rest is used and applied to the Sabbath, that God rested on the seventh day, and therefore he sanctified it or set it apart. But here in Genesis 1, the concept is cessation from work, and that is because God didn't rest because he was weary. And that's in contrast to the Babylonian gods. His kids being noisy don't make him lose any sleep, because he doesn't sleep. The important thing to realize, or at least one of the important things to realize about this story, is that no violence exists in the Genesis creation stories. So let's look at these theological foundations. In the Hebrew Bible, creation transforms chaos. In Babylon, Marduk slays chaos in the form of Tiamat for creation of the world. In the Hebrew Bible, creation is an act of God by divine fiat, that is, by his command, by his word. In Babylon, creation comes from a divine carcass. In the Hebrew Bible, humans are created in God's image. In Babylon, humans are created from the blood of a slain deity. That is chaos. And finally, in the Hebrew Bible, humans are to govern the natural world, whereas in Babylon, they are to be slaves of the gods. I'll take a brief look at Atrahasis, which is another story that has, really the flood story, but it also has creation of human beings in it. Human beings are granted divine mental powers, the slain god's blood, because the Babylonians believed that intelligence lay in the blood. And that's one of the reasons why they used liver divination so extensively, the liver being the organ with the greatest amount of blood, so that they would know what the gods were thinking or communicating to them. In Enuma Elish, Kingu is the instigator of Tiamat's rebellion, is slain, and he is slain to create human slave labor as substitutes for the God's work. You don't find that even in Genesis 2. In Genesis 2, we are servants of the earth. We serve the earth. And we take care of it. But we're not slaves. The word does not have to connote slavery in that chapter. So let's look at perceptions of deity. Similarities first. We need similarities in order to understand the differences better. Both Israel and Babylonia held deity in high regard. Both tended to see worship as reverence for deity. Both could perceive deity as both merciful and just. Both believed that they could sin and thus fall out of favor with deity. Both viewed deity as punishing sinners for their sins. Both tried to atone for their sins and regain deity's favor. Both felt deity would welcome prayers of praise and petition. These are very superficial similarities. But if we look deeper, we find some very significant contrasts. So here are the differences. And of course, one obvious difference is that Babylonia worshipped many gods. They believed in polytheism. Whereas Israel held to monotheism and worshipped one God. In Babylonia, gods were like humans, only much more powerful. In Israel, God was above humans with a vastly holier character. In Babylonia, Marduk was now merciful, then wrathful, without warning or explanation. In Israel, God's wrath was always a response to sin, and his character is one of mercy, not anger. And we'll be looking at that more in depth at a later time. In Babylonia, no deity ever claimed any group of Babylonians as his people or gave specific laws to them. In Israel, God was quite clear about what he wanted, even if his commands changed according to circumstances. And the Babylonians rarely knew why they were being punished. Israel was never left in doubt. I should say one qualification. Israel was never left in doubt until Israel went to Babylon. And then they adopted the Babylonian views of sin and punishment and believed that every time they were sick or met with misfortune or died, they were being punished by deity. In Babylonia, immortality was denied humans arbitrarily by the gods. In Israel, immortality was originally given conditionally. When forfeited, it could be regained. So in Babylonia, the Babylonians had no choice but to be mortal. But in Israel, according to Israel, human beings had a choice, and they did not keep that choice. They lost it through sin, but they are promised it again if they remain faithful and trusting in God. In Babylonia, the gods fated the people's destinies. In Israel, God's purpose was for Israel to trust and obey him so that all would go well with them forever. In Babylonia, fear of deity meant awe as well as being afraid. Israel could experience fear of deity, but mostly fear meant awe or reverence and respect. In Babylonia, hymns, prayers, incantations, burning incense, offering food offerings, etc., were done to appease the gods. In Israel, while some no doubt sought to appease God, prayers, hymns, and sacrifices were part of worship and relationship. The Babylonians were distant from their gods like they were with their kings. While they had a personal God with whom they were more intimate, the relationship involved manipulation, negotiation, and control, as befit their status as slaves of the gods. Israel's relationship with deity was based on the covenant, involving fidelity and trust. In the Psalms, Israelites felt comfortable confiding in God, pleading with him to answer their petitions, praising him for what he had done for them personally, and trusting him for who he was. Major players like Abraham and Moses could reason with God, something the Babylonians did not attempt to do. The Babylonians viewed their gods as often angered and needing appeasement. Even when not angry, Babylonians performed acts of worship to keep them calm and prevent arousing their wrath. Consequently, the Babylonians tended to view sin as something that angered the gods, though they were cognizant of the sins that offended them. In Israel, divine anger is always tied to sin and often represents the consequences of sinning. In Babylonia, though specific sins might be seen on a basic level as having not good consequences, the overall Babylonian motive for living a righteous life was to avoid angering the gods. In Israel, though cognizant of divine anger against sin, the predominant motive for keeping God's laws was that things would go well with them and with their children. Overall, the Hebrew Bible emphasizes the outcome or reaping of the results of sin. The Babylonians were free to do in daily life whatever their social status allowed them to do. In terms of deity, it's doubtful that they saw themselves as free. The fates or destinies given them by the gods seemed to curtail their freedom. In Israel, the Hebrew Bible places freedom at the core of human value in the Garden of Eden. Freedom to choose for or against God, not divine fate, determined the consequences. I want to make one statement that changes this picture a little bit. It's true that the Babylonians in their relationship with God did not feel real free. But they could be pretty secular in their thinking, because once they appeased the gods and did all they could to serve them appropriately, they didn't have to worry too much about how they lived their life, although certain social norms did dictate that they not abuse their neighbor. In the Hebrew Bible, the covenant relationship is entirely encompassing a person's life. It involves all aspects of it. All aspects of human life is to be holy. And in that respect, the Hebrew Bible demands more. In a legal setting, you can minimize things pretty easily. Sin and the fall in Babylonia. Now we come to chapter 3. The Babylonians had no concept of a point in time in which human beings fell into sin. In their view, the gods arbitrarily fated humanity to be mortal and not live forever. There are two myths and one epic that depict this. The one myth especially is Adapa, who breaks the wing of the south wind, causes no wind to blow, which was needed for crops to grow, and ends up getting called to the gods to answer for this. And by trickery, he is led to make the wrong choice and not receive immortality. And the gods laugh at him and send him back to earth. In the Gilgamesh epic, Gilgamesh goes to try to find immortality. He goes to the Babylonian Noah, Utnapishtim, and spends some time with Utnapishtim, who has him go diving into the depths of the sea and retrieve a plant that grew there. And if he could make it back home with that plant, to use that plant, he would live forever. On the way home, he gets hot and tired and decides to take a dip in a very inviting pool. He lays the plant aside and goes swimming. And when he comes out, he sees a snake skin lying there, and his plant is gone. The snake has taken the plant, eaten it, and has shed his skin. So he goes home without immortality. So this is pretty arbitrary by the gods, as opposed to human beings who forfeit their immortality. The Sumerians earlier conceived of a pure place they called Dilmun, where the ravens did not caw, where lions and wolves did not prey on other animals. The place had none of the diseases and ailments common to humanity, and no one said they were old. No darkness and no crime was there. No one wept or wailed. That's the Sumerians. The Sumerians precede the Babylonians. The Babylonians referred to no such place, and while they understood something about sin and transgression that displeased the gods, they little understood either sin or the gods. So now we come to sin and the fall in the Bible. In its earliest chapters, the Bible presents sin and the fall in various ways. Sin as succumbing to a cunning creature who feeds us lies about God and undermines his trustworthiness, leading us to distrust him. Sin as disobedience to God's clear command not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Sin as opening the eyes to see evil, to be being tricked by a mastermind, to feeling vulnerable and naked. Sin as failing to master a demonic monster crouching, ready to strike. And that last one, of course, comes from the Cain and Abel story. The demonic monster is found in the term crouching, which is a participle. And participles refer to the one who does the crouching. That is related to a demon in Babylonian literature known as someone who harasses people. Canonically, then, sin is believing lies about God, distrusting him, disobedience, and failure to master the demonic foe of humankind. Let's look at some background to the fall in Genesis 3. This will not make a whole lot of sense until we move on, but hang in there. In both royal and divine councils, kings and gods held plans and messages in secret. To reveal the king's or God's secrets was to be a traitor. In contrast, God reveals his secrets to his servants, the prophets, who in turn deliver them openly to the people. Divination was a method of attempting to understand what the gods were revealing. The god of divination was Shamash. Through the use of magic, a person could ward off evil spirits and obtain special powers over their adversaries. The god of magic was Ea. The serpent was portrayed as crafty and good, but also as the personification of death. This is in Babylon. So what I've come to conclude after learning about these background information is that the serpent is the Babylonian host taking human beings on a journey into sin. The serpent's opening words, "Did God say?" may relate to the Babylonian divination when diviners attempted to learn what the gods were saying through opening up a sheep and examining its liver, or interpreting a dream or some abnormality in the heavens. It was believed that the gods communicated through these means, and ascertaining what they said amounted to a magical science. So this idea of "did God say?" is that question that diviners have in the back of their minds, is what is God, or what are the gods saying? What did the gods say? By questioning what God said, the serpent appears to elevate the woman to a position just under himself, a pretended member of Yahweh's council, where he learned the secrets of Yahweh that he now can transmit to her. In this, he resembles Ea, who goes against the secret will of the gods and tells the Babylonian Noah indirectly of a flood by talking to the wall. By contrast, God tells his secrets to his prophets to make known those secrets to the people. Similarly to uttering an incantation, the serpent cast his spell on the woman so that she misquotes God's word. She corrects the serpent's inference that God abandoned her from all the trees of the garden. We may not eat from it, this one tree, lest we die, she says. The serpent retorts with a direct negation. Not you will die. Furthermore, furthering his image as an expert in the divine assembly, privy to God's secrets, he says, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This becoming like God is the real destiny of humanity, but it can only come to the magic produced by eating of this tree. The inference is strong. God knows something you don't know, that if you knew, you would become the possessor of the knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge here becomes the knowledge of magic, a form of Babylonian wisdom that gave its possessors power. So here's the path of the serpent. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was delightful to the eyes, and was desired to make one wise, she took some of its fruit and ate. This wisdom consisted of magic. The fruit of the tree over which she was created master had magical powers to give her special knowledge. Step by step, the crafty serpent took the woman from a straightforward command and warning of something that involved inevitable consequences to a world of magic in which piece of fruit had the power to make her wise, and to see the secret things of God, making her more like God. One other note, in addition to resembling the crafty Ea, the snake operated under its patron deity Ninazu, the god of the netherworld and the king of snakes. The Babylonian snake came to personify death. The snake further tears her down. He questions her mind. Does she really know what God said? By negating God's clear words, you will not surely die, the serpent belittles her as naive to trust her creator. By offering her the fruit, he denotes her from having dominion over nature. A creature offers her fruit from a plant. And by promising her that her eyes would become open, he infers that her vision is not good and that she cannot see. By promising her that she will become like God, he denies that God made her in his image. She is now ready to adopt a new world of magic, power, and fear, and to accept abuse. The results of this will be tragic. From the reality of God's creation, in which cause and effect play a foundational role, the serpent's seed will come to live in a reality that is a fraud. Instead of love awakening love, humans will swear loyalty oaths, invoking the penalty of the gods if broken, as the Babylonians did. Instead of trust based on trustworthiness, humans will invent a legal system to ensure trust, as the Babylonians did. Instead of enjoying relationships of mutual respect, giving, and freedom, humans will contrive substitute relationships of manipulation, anger, and appeasement, control, and force, as the Babylonians did. The magical realm is a fake, dim resemblance of who God is, what he created for us, and how he made us to live. This magical reality will become the world of the Babylonians. Now we're going to change topics to the flood story, since that's the next major event in Genesis. The similarities are as follows. Human beings do something to cause the gods distress. A god pronounces a flood upon the earth. A god contacts one man to warn him of the flood. The god states that the man should build a boat. The man builds a boat and is saved from the flood. Birds and animals are saved in it too, and the flood covers the earth for a specified time. The differences are as follows. In Babylonia, the cause of the flood is noisy humans. In the Hebrew Bible, evil thoughts and violence are the cause. In Babylonia, the state of the god is angry. In the Hebrew Bible, God is grief-stricken. In Babylonia, the divine choice is to destroy humanity. In the Hebrew Bible, I think the Bible as a whole bears out that God intends to save as many as possible. In Babylonia, one deity saves one man. In the Hebrew Bible, God saves all who he can. In Babylonia, the flood causes divine assembly fear. In the Hebrew Bible, it causes the cleansing of the earth. In Babylonia, the gods come to sacrifice like flies. In the Hebrew Bible, God makes a rainbow. My Acadian professor suggested, and I believe she wrote an article on this, that the flies are the Babylonian rainbow. It is possible the Babylonians didn't see rainbows very often, but they must have been aware of them, because if you look at the fly in the sunlight, it has iridescent colors like a rainbow. And the thing you need to know is that the gods come to the sacrifice like flies because they're hungry. They have been deprived of food from their slaves during the time that their dad and the Babylonian Noah at Atrahasis in this case, or Utnapishtim in Gilgamesh, both of them have this part of the story. While they're on the boat, they can't feed the gods, so the gods go hungry during this time. In Babylonia, the gods decide to limit procreation. In the Hebrew Bible, God shortens human life. And I think you can see that the Babylonian flood stories seem to kind of trivialize this, what the enormity of the problem. Instead of there being violence, wholesale violence to the point where everyone's ready to kill one another off to the last person, you have a situation where the gods are self-centered, the kids are noisy and violent and keep them from getting their rest, and so they want to kill their kids. In this case, it's the human beings they created. Their slaves are noisy and making noise. There could be an aspect of violence in that, but it isn't adequately expressed, and the self-centeredness of the gods seems to be pretty preeminent. We now come to the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is about substitution and power. The words, "Come, let us make bricks," is a parody of God's statement in Genesis, "Let us make humankind in our image." They substitute brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. This is the beginning of technology. And they say, "Let us build ourselves a city." Again, the "let us" and let them have dominion. This is a parody of those words, "let them have dominion." What the Babylonians want is settled living, control, power over other human beings instead of over nature. The models of the institutions that human beings created in the plain of Shinar would never have existed without cities. And this is one of the reasons the Bible is so opposed to city life, at least in these chapters. They build a tower. This is a substitute for a mountain, since they don't have mountains in Iraq, at least in the southern region of Iraq where the Babylonians lived. And mountains were symbols of divine power. They were the abode of the gods. So let's build one so that the gods will come and live with us. And so we have to ask the question, who built the city and tower? Willing volunteers or slaves? Probably slaves. Let's look again at the "let us make a name for ourselves." I guess that actually is at the end of the chapter. Name in Babylonia meant existence. The first two lines of Enuma Elish, "When on high," there was no name for the different things that were later created. Therefore, there was no existence. If you look at those first two lines of unedited, they really denote that name means existence. The end result of that is, if you can give something existence by naming it, you have special power. And in magic, naming the person that you were trying to heal was the actual essential part that gave that magic power to work. In the Bible, name can represent moral character, and that seems to be its predominant use. When God passes before Moses, proclaims before him his name, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God gracious, merciful, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. All of that is his name. It represents his moral character. Now we come to the ancient models for relationships that the Babylonians invented, and I'm contrasting them here with the Hebrew Bible and creation. In my view, God created three models: nature, marriage and family, and Sabbath. Nature represents the cause and effect natural laws that we operate by, the laws that are involve inevitability, that are not arbitrary. Nature also gives us illustrations of interconnection and self-control and the orderliness of it in ecosystems that serve other parts of the system in a perfect circle. And nature also gives us illustrations of love, nurture, and unselfishness. In marriage and family, there is intimacy, trust, and teamwork, nurturing, development, and love, trust, and trustworthiness. You can tell I like the word trust a lot. I use it too much. In Sabbath, there is inclusion and equality. Everyone was to work, even the animals. Was to rest, even the animals. There was inclusion and equality. No one was excluded. There's rest and freedom. The freedom part comes from the Sabbath commandment as it's found in Deuteronomy 5, where it's said to be a memorial of God rescuing the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. And there's time for relationships. In Babylon, things are invented more than they're created. And the Babylonians had three models too that they created: economics, hierarchy, and legal structures. And I've had students in past years question, why are legal structures invented by Babylon? Why aren't they created by God? Well, the kind of laws that God laid down were built on principles that are built on cause and effect relationships. Therefore, the heart and meaning of God's laws are descriptive as opposed to prescriptive. It's true they're prescriptive in form to meet us where we are, but they're descriptive in content. That's particularly true of the Ten Commandments. Other laws that seem to be really resemble Hammurabi's laws, which the Book of the Covenant does, can be said to God meeting people where they are and adapting to their will. Under economics, nothing is fixed or stable, everything is arbitrary. You have substitution, competition, inflation. Economics tends to objectify people and promote slavery. Even if we get paid for it, sometimes we act like we're slaves. It also, under hierarchy and kingship, There's the importance of power over others. One person has the right to rule over others, something God never intended to have. The external locus of control, external instead of the internal locus of control. And angry kings must be appeased, something we'll be talking more about in the future. Under legal structures are the means of external control. Compliance comes through fear of legal consequences, and enforcement of legal matters is through penalties. We will pick up with these ancient models for relationships when we return to talk about Babylon and the Bible. Because understanding these is crucial for understanding theology. Our theology, to a great extent, has come from the Babylonian models that they invented. So if we take an overview of what we've gone through this afternoon, I hope it becomes clear that the Babylonian models of their deities involve force, arbitration, harsh penalty, external enforcement, and appeasement. God's to be feared, not to be loved and trusted. Whereas in the Hebrew Bible, the more unique we see the Bible against Babylon, that is, the unique features of the Old Testament really tell us that God's preferred measures are not measures of force. They're not measures of punitive behavior. They are measures intended to save, to create trust, and to show us his love. Hi, Bill.
Sorry. Yeah. I was just going to, if you want to stop, well, I guess I can pause the recording or stop it.